Hello and a very warm welcome. You're watching the NewsTrack. I'm Rahul Kanwal. This is a special edition of the NewsTrack because I am delighted to be joined by two of the world's foremost experts on China, on trade, and on what's happening in the Trumpian world. I want to introduce first William Kirby. William Kirby is arguably America's top China scholar. He's at Harvard University, runs the China Fund. He's an historian and also an economist and understands this trade war between China and the United States in a historical arc. And some of the comments he's been making are viraling in academic circles, corporate circles. So I requested him to join us and he's agreed and I'm delighted that he's here. Welcome, sir. I also have Martin Wolf, one of the world's leading economic commentators, heads up the economic coverage of the Financial Times, is tracked very widely. Again, the world over, people who matter read his articles very closely. So you've got two super sharp minds, one from the United States, the other from Europe, to talk to us about what the post-Trump tariff world looks like.
World's biggest economies at loggerheads. Tit for tat, tariffs and trade war. Who holds the trump card? Who will blink first? US versus China tariff war decoded. That is our big focus on the NewsTrack.
While American President Donald Trump has put a pause on his tariffs against other countries, he's going all out, for the most part, against China with a few exceptions. You have a situation in the larger context of economic rivalry between two superpowers, a situation where you've got an emerging power up against the modern-day superpower, and they're now very deeply in conflict. Now, this is being looked at different planes. This is being looked at in the moment in terms of what's happening on tariffs, where the headlines change on a day-to-day basis. But we can also step out and look from far in a larger historic arc, the economic rivalry between the current power and the emerging power, and what's happened in the past when these two economic powers and giants have been in conflict, going back millennia, going back centuries. It's a very tough thing to do, but it's something that Professor William Kirby, my guest on the NewsTrack today, specializes in. And I want to tell our viewers a bit about why this guest is so special, because he's at the intersection of history, started out as a historian, and economics. A highly rated professor at Harvard University, runs the Harvard China Fund, author, hugely acclaimed expert. And if you read academic circles and see what professors are saying at this moment, many of them are quoting Bill Kirby. So I requested Professor Kirby to join us on this broadcast, and here he is. Thank you very much, Professor Kirby, for taking out time and joining us on India Today. I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
It's a real pleasure to join you on India Today. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir. Sir, I want to start by getting you to explain to our viewers, in a historical prism, what we're seeing currently between, take the personalities out, Trump versus Xi, but in a historical prism, the battle between the modern day power, the United States, and an emerging power that hopes very clearly to unseat the standing economic power. So just zoom out, explain this in a historical context, and then we'll build on that.
Well, I think we need to take it back several centuries in order to understand where we are. You talked about China as an emerging power, and of course it is, but it's also a returning power. My colleagues and I have just finished a new online course called The Return of China. Mm-hmm. And, when the United States, I live here in Lexington, Massachusetts, where 250 years ago this month, the American Revolution broke out. But when the American Revolution broke out, this was a kind of economic and cultural backwater of a comparatively undeveloped Britain in comparison with the great Qing Empire, which was in many ways the most sophisticated polity and the largest, and without question, the largest economy on earth. And what you see today with the rise, one can call it the rise or the return of China to a position of global eminence, the rise, or in many ways, the return of India to a position of, these are civilization states that have an enduring impact on the history of the world. And the United States, we have to, with a good bit of humility in this country, which is unusual for us, we have to recognize that the United States has been around less long than the Great Qing Dynasty, which was the last of 24 imperial dynasties in China. And so what you are seeing today is in many ways really a mutual paranoia on the part of the United States and of China. Sometimes I think quite unwanted fear in the United States about China's return to prosperity and its seeking a position of global influence in the world, and a paranoia in China about what the intent of the United States is toward it and toward its attempted return to a position of eminence. The one simple lesson of history, in the history of U.S.-China relations, is that whenever these two countries have worked together, it has been very good for both countries. And whenever they have been at loggerheads, or at worst, at war in Korea, it has been very bad for both countries. Both have an enormous stake in having an accommodation at this moment in time and finding a way to work and live with one another, because our interests are much more intertwined economically, culturally, educationally, than ever they have been before, even if our political and strategic aims seem to have gone further apart.
So use what history teaches us to now project out into the future. And given the lessons from history, when these two economic giants clash in the way that now seems inevitable and probably irreversible, how does it play out in your view?
Well, I don't think it's inevitable, and I don't think it's irreversible. I do think you see here a panicked set of responses on the part of Americans who, particularly in the Trump administration, who see this as, and again, the Trump administration, as you will know, is hardly a united group. There are many different views within it, many of which wish to engage more deeply with China. At the same time, you have others who seek to, as it were, bludgeon China into trade agreements as the United States believed it had done in the 1980s with Japan. So several of Trump's advisors on the tariff business basically are children of the 1980s in terms of their policy backgrounds, and sought to use pressure on Japan in order to change and alter the trade balance between Japan and the United States at that point. But what we did also in the 1980s was to begin to welcome and allow Japanese investment into this country, in particular in the automobile industry, to the great benefit of the American public and actually to the ultimate benefit of the American automobile industry. But at the moment, that is not the way the world is going today. And if you look at your great wall of tariffs here, it is, if it weren't so tragic, it would be comical to see numbers such as this. India's so-called reciprocal tariff was imposed at 27% before this 90-day pause brought it back to 10% temporarily. But even a 27% increase of tariffs on India could reduce Indian exports to the U.S. by $30 billion or more, costing India nearly 1 point of GDP, prospectively. We just don't know what will happen, because you see here an administration that is quite literally making it up on the fly. And that is not good for the global economy. It's not good for stability. And so I hope that more sane views will prevail in Washington to allow for reasonable conversations between the United States and its major trading partners, China and India included.
This has happened in the past. You said we can go back several millennia. The fact is, when there are two powerful empires and they turn their economic backs on each other, how does it typically impact the other emerging powers, countries like India? So looked at more from a historical lens, what do you think is the more likely impact of these trade wars, which you're calling not irreversible, on a country like India?
Well, I would say the history gives us uneven guidance, as it always does. History is much easier. As a historian, I find it much easier to predict the past than to predict the future. But if you're to look at where we have been before the First World War, the European economy was extraordinarily integrated. Germany and France and Russia to a considerable degree, certainly Germany and Britain, as great rivals as they were in matters military and matters naval, their economies were complementary one to another to a significant degree. And that did not stop war from breaking out. In the Second World War, by contrast, is the best example we know of in which trading blocs actually seem to accelerate the pace of conflict. The high American tariffs, the Smoot-Hawley tariffs of the early 1930s, have long been considered one of the causes of turning a real recession into the Great Depression. The fact that you would have currency blocks turning a pound block, a yen block, a dollar block, limiting global trade to those areas. The trade disputes between the United States and Japan are without question proximate causes of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941.
Okay, let's spend a moment on how this plays out for the United States. Over the weekend, all the major research houses have increased almost to 60% the probability of the United States going into recession. Are you seeing Trump at this moment as a master negotiator? He's pulled out the sword, said, I want to behead you, and then just not put the sword back into the sheath, but basically held back the attack. Now, precipitating the process of trade negotiation, which may have otherwise taken, say, years, he kind of tries to pack it in say, a 90-day window, which may or may not get fulfilled in that period. So do you see this as negotiation tactics by someone who's super smart, or do you think the guy frankly has no clue about what he's doing and is just making up policy on the fly?
Well, I'm feared that the truth may more be on the latter side of your question rather than on the former side of it. One can hope that there is a grand strategy behind this and an end game that is clearly played out. But you see extraordinary amounts of division within the administration. You see Mr. Musk attacking Mr. Navarro, the trade representative of President Trump, the trade advisor of President Trump. And so the fear is this consistent. The one thing that is consistent is the policy continues to change almost daily, a flip and flopping of priorities. And so the one thing that is constant is the inconstancy of it. That is possible that this level of inconstancy will speed negotiations. I think that's actually a very good point. It will speed negotiations that might well have taken many, many years, but it will not necessarily lead to great outcomes if one believes, as Mr. Trump clearly does, the one area of utter consistency is he believes that tariffs are important. He believes that they are a means of raising revenue, as he does not see them for what they are, which is taxation on goods and ultimately on the people who purchase those goods. So a major tax increase on Americans. So it is that is absolutely consistent. He believes in this policy instrument, but his capacity to wield it is hindered dramatically by his own inconsistency and by the fact that he seems to agree with whomever he has last spoken with.
Let's spend some time on China and your understanding of the impact of these tariffs on China. because outside China, there are very few people who understand China the way that you do. In the belligerence with which Xi Jinping has hit back, he's not come to the negotiating table like Trump said, we'll have a meeting, we'll try and talk things out. Xi doesn't seem interested. Why is that?
Well, I don't think any country could not react to the kind of aggressive tariffs as this near declaration of economic war by the United States on China, at least so it appears at this 145% rate. That does not apply to all goods, for example, and some of the most important goods and most valuable goods are exempt from those tariffs. It's really quite a complex and messy situation. But I don't think President Xi would have had any choice but to respond. And it isn't just President Xi. I think any Chinese leader would have no choice but to respond in some way or other. And I can guarantee you that if India were suddenly hit with 145% tariff increase, Mr. Modi, I think, would be hard-pressed not to respond to this. This is what governments do. They have to respond. They have domestic constituencies. They have to, if there is to be a negotiation, they will want to go in with a stronger rather than weaker hand. And there are, thousands of American businesses in China, millions and millions of Americans who regularly are customers of Chinese goods. These are all constituents in what had been a largely beneficial bilateral economic relationship between the United States and China over the last quarter century.
Will this tariff war lead to an economic decoupling between Beijing and DC, given how intertwined these two economies are? Is that even possible? Is the world likely to be divided into two trading blocs?
Right. I think it is possible. I think it's unlikely, but I think it is possible. These two countries, in many ways, could not be more intertwined in their economies, more mutually reliant one on another in their economies. At the same time, you have a history of U.S.-China relations at times when we were deeply involved, for example, politically and militarily in China in the 1940s, ending with a total cutoff of relations from the early 1950s until the early 1970s, and really until the early 1980s in practical terms. So it is possible to see decoupling, but that was a period of enormous tragedy, we must remember. It's a period when Americans and Chinese fought each other in the utterly needless Korean War. It is a time in which all business contacts were severed, all academic contacts, which had been very robust between American and Chinese universities, were severed. And if we believe that decoupling is somehow to the benefit of either the United States and China, then we actually don't know our history at all.
Trump's premise is that he can make America great again when it comes to manufacturing. You've seen all the social media memes. The fact is that America doesn't have a workforce that can do low-end manufacturing. The workers are simply not there. So how does this play out? Because as I speak to industrialists, especially in India, those who have interest in the US and elsewhere, they're putting a lot of investment decisions on hold because they frankly don't know what to expect next in terms of tariffs. And in that uncertainty, no one's going to go out and commit to major capacity expansion plans. The idea that Trump can, with the use of tariffs, turn America into a manufacturing power like it used to be back in the day, is that possible, or is he just chasing an oasis?
Well, the fact is, of course, that this era of globalization has cost the United States many thousands of jobs in the industrial sector. But if you were to look at, for example, where we have lost positions, are these the kind of industries that we would like to revive in the United States? I don't think you can find too many descendants or too many older people who used to work in American textile factories who believe that a revived textile industry would be a source of pride for the United States. These were difficult jobs that have been replaced in some cases by higher value-added manufacturing positions, such as in the international automobile industry and so on. What's much more likely to happen is that more industry, more Chinese industry, and more multinational companies will move to other places beyond China. This has already happened, of course, as Chinese firms have set up factories in Southeast Asia, in South America, in Mexico. India stands to benefit, possibly, from this ridiculously high degree of tariffs on Chinese goods, if it stands, which I doubt that it will, because that could entice multinational companies to move production from China to India. iPhone production, for example. Now, the iPhone isn't quite what it once was, but Apple aims to move iPhone production so that India can account for half of American demands, given that the tariffs on Chinese goods could add maybe $400, $500 to the cost of my phone right here. And in that case, maybe I would be better off buying a Huawei phone.
Oh, you could just buy a made in India iPhone. That's my suggestion.
That's all right. Okay, I'll do that. I'll do that.
How does this impact China in the current economic moment, given the fact that they have an aging population, fewer younger people than they did in the past, a real estate bubble which continues to be a cause of concern, slacking consumption demand? So it's not as if this tariff wall gets built, that China can just ride over. They have a consumption challenge and they have a growth challenge. They've got this capacity, they need to export.
Well, they actually, I'll come back to their need to export, but this is not a good time for the Chinese economy, even before this kind of declaration of economic war by the United States. China is suffering what I would call a political and economic long COVID. And many of the problems that emerged during the COVID lockdown have persisted consistently. Demand has not picked back up. Internally, the real estate market has continued to collapse. Now it's perhaps at bottom. But the many, really hundreds of millions of Chinese feel less wealthy today than they did 5 years ago, considerably less wealthy. Those with resources have tried to either get their resources out of the country or their children out of the country. Others, of course, are simply hunkering down. And so you see malls with numbers of vacant stores and so on in a way that you did not up to 5 years ago. Does China absolutely need to export in order to grow, however? It has been, of course, the major source of growth in the industrial economy, or one of the two major sources of growth. But domestic consumption had been one. That is now considerably lowered. What one is missing in this, and what the Chinese government has missed all along, perhaps it will change tack now, is that China, unlike the United States, unlike Europe, has another internal market of 200 to 300 million people who are simply too poor to consume. These people have no social safety net whatsoever. And if they were given one, if they were given rudimentary health care, education, so on, at prices that individuals could afford, that families could afford, so if they were given the rights to own the land for farmers, that their families had plowed for generations rather than have the state own the land and gain all the profits from its eventual sale. If those things were to happen, you could see an enormous domestic boom in China based on a new generation of consumers at home.
Does he have the financial wherewithal to unleash such a government-led stimulus?
It does. It does, absolutely. It would be a stimulus that is based also on fundamental policy changes, particularly in terms of property ownership for farmers. And so, but Mr. Xi Jinping, he is a communist leader. He's the chair, of course, chair of the Chinese Communist Party, general secretary of the party, but he's not a socialist at heart. He doesn't believe in welfare. He says welfareism makes people lazy. And yet, if you're a poor farmer in China, you cannot work hard enough in order to get well enough off in order to be a major consumer in that market. And you are consigned ultimately to poverty. There's a great businessman in Thailand, Danin Cheravanant of the big agribusiness, the CP Group. This is a Chinese family that has been active for over a century in Southeast Asia and now in China. And he has a very wise saying. He says a rich country cannot have poor farmers. And if you look at any enduringly rich country today, whether it's in Europe, North America, or East Asia, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, they all have vibrant agricultural sectors. China only has poor farmers. And that is a problem that the government could begin to resolve through a variety of social safety net measures and educational improvements and many other ways of bringing these people, helping to bring these people out of poverty. But at the moment...
Would that mean at an admission by Xi Jinping that things are much worse than he'd like? Because he likes to project military economic strength, great strategic acumen. If he dials back on notions that have been a key part of his economic DNA for decades, then is that just an admission by the almighty Xi that things aren't as rosy in mainland China as he'd like the world to believe?
Well, the almighty Xi, as you put it, President Xi, did reverse himself from one day to the next on zero COVID.
Sure.
And so he is a person who is capable of grand gestures. This is, in principle, a socialist regime. Nothing would be more socialist than trying to help those of greater need, those in greater need. But at the moment, you have two constituencies that are really not doing well at all. Obviously, farmers and the rural sector, generally speaking, in economic terms. But then second, you have youth. You mentioned the demographic challenge that China has, but China still has a large number of young people today, and the de facto unemployment rate of young people in China, 16 to 24, is probably about 40%. And that the official number is, of course, much lower. Is closer to 20%. But the official number assumes that if you work 1 day a month, then therefore you are employed. But it's a stunning degree of youth unemployment today that is perhaps a social problem waiting to happen.
How serious is that problem? Because it's like a giant dark curtain. You can't really see through it. 40% youth unemployment is a lot. Is there a crisis bubbling just below the surface waiting to explode?
There may be, but I think that it's a crisis that can be averted with policy changes by the government, with increased stimulus, with perhaps reduced investment on physical infrastructure and greater investment on human infrastructure, on the human capital that comprises this extraordinary country.
Given what you know of the current state of play between China and the United States, and given what's happened in the past when there's been a similar economic rivalry between the two most important powers of the world, and if nothing were to change, I know you suggested that you think that there'll be a dial back on the part of Donald Trump. If that doesn't happen and the tariffs persist and the war gets worse, the economic war gets worse, which of these two elephants wins in your view in the future? What does the future look like, Professor, if I were to ask you to project?
Yes. Well, I think neither of them win. I think it would be destructive to both economies, probably more destructive to the American economy and to American leadership in the world. The United States has been, in many ways, both a leader and a guardian of the global economic order, and now we are the country that has brought about the greatest global disorder in the international economy. And China has been comparatively consistent in its approach. But I think both countries lose. Neither side wins. What is also lost, though, if you were to think of the greater danger of a U.S.-China confrontation beyond the economic confrontation, is that working together on matters economic is not a precondition, but it has been an important part of U.S.-China cooperation on many other fronts. before the Trump administration on climate change, before in better times on the denuclearization of North Korea and the Korean Peninsula. And I always say, if if one thinks of the areas where a physical struggle, a war, is more likely to break out in East Asia involving both China and the United States, the two obvious places are either in Korea or in the Taiwan Strait.
Does this war, the tariff war, make Xi, in your view, more likely to make a go for the Taiwan Straits?
Unclear. I think it gives him more to worry about in the immediate terms at home, so maybe makes it less likely that one does something dramatic. But the fact is, anyone who knows anything about the situation between Taiwan, mainland, and the United States, the best security for Taiwan is in a professional and ideally friendly relationship between Washington and Beijing. When Washington and Beijing are at odds, Taiwan is at much greater risk than when they work together. And this is something.
No, but can I counter argue? I mean, you're the professor, I'm just asking a question, so allow me that. The counter logic to what you're saying, sir, could be that if China and the United States are getting along really well, then the United States feels less compelled to jump in if China attacks Taiwan. But when China and the United States are already daggers drawn, that then puts someone like a President Trump gives him a greater chance of going in to save Taiwan, because China is doing something he doesn't like.
I don't think so. I think, first of all, daggers drawn economically can lead to all kinds of other conflict. But I think a military conflict, one has to understand the risks for all sides in a military conflict, and they are not small.
Sure.
Obviously, the risks to Taiwan are enormous. The risks to the United States for its credibility and its capacity are very large. But above all, the risks to China are extraordinary, because a war in the Taiwan Strait would end China's international economic cooperation, not just with the United States overnight, but also in all likelihood with Japan, with Korea, with Europe, and so on. This would be a major catastrophe for the Chinese economy and for China's position in the world. And even if China won a war over Taiwan, what does it get? It gets 23 million people who don't want to be part of it. It gets a beautiful island, to be sure. It reunites the country in a theoretical sense, but it will set China back very dramatically for the point of view for the pursuit of narrowly nationalist territorial aims. Now, the United States would have a better plank to stand on if its own president weren't calling for the territorial expansion of the United States in such strategically important places as Greenland. Give me a break. But I think the most important thing is, it's so important that the leaders of China and the United States, and above all, their national security people, their military people, their economic security people, begin to talk very directly one with another. Because the longer that this goes on, the more entrenched these attitudes will be, and the more entrenched certain policies may become. And there's a great British historian of modern international history named A.J.P. Taylor, who said this: war is never inevitable until it breaks out.
Wow. Professor Bill Kirby, I was on a Harvard Business School call with some professors for my batch last week. There were several who were quoting you, which is when I said we must reach out to you and have you on the show, and they were all super impressed with the insights that you had to offer on this particular topic. This has been an absolute delight. Not that everything that you've said has been music to anybody's ears, it's not, but you've been able to put it in context and in a framework which is super sharp and incisive, and for that I appreciate you taking our time and joining us here on the India Today NewsTrack. Thank you, sir.
Wow, it's been an honor to be with you. Thank you so much for having me on India Today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. What does the post-tariff world look like? Lots of conversation the world over around how this impacts the United States, India, and economic growth in other countries. To talk about what to expect from here on, we're joined live and exclusive on the NewsTrack by one of the world's sharpest economic affairs commentators, Martin Wolf from the Financial Times. His articles and thoughts are very closely tracked world over, so we're very delighted at a time of so much uncertainty, Mr. Wolf, that you could take out time and join us in India today. Thank you.
It's a pleasure, of course.
So you've written in one of your columns that Trump's tariff formula is utter lunacy. Do you want to start by explaining why you think Trump has got his tariff script all wrong?
Well, I think you have to separate the objectives from the calculations, and both are pretty crazy. Trump believes that in the right world, a decent world, bilateral trade would balance with every country in the world. This is like saying, it's a strange metaphor, but it's like saying that my trade with my barber should balance. Obviously it doesn't. I spend money with some people and I earn money from other people, far fewer of course, and as long as my income and my expenditures balance, I'm fine. So the same applies to countries. There's absolutely no reason to worry about bilateral trade. The US has an overall deficit, that's an issue, but you never try to balance with every country. Now, having decided that's the objective, they have decided on a formula which essentially increases the tariff with the size of the bilateral deficit. So essentially, it's the ratio of the bilateral deficit of the US with its total imports from a country. So the bigger the deficit relative to the total imports from the country, the higher the tariff. And that also makes absolutely no sense, because you might have a big bilateral deficit with a country simply because it makes something you don't produce and you want. So you have a big bilateral deficit. Now they're going to impose a massive tariff on the import, or they were proposing, they now stopped, to impose a massive tariff on the import of something that they actually want. And it led to some really crazy results. Just about the highest tariff was going to be imposed on Lesotho. And if you think about it, I mean, it's obvious, it cannot possibly make sense for the gigantic United States to be worried about a bilateral deficit with Lesotho.
Okay, let's take this one by one. What does a post-Trump tariff world look like according to you? Right now, there is some fluidity around the tariffs he imposes, pauses, takes back, does multiple somersaults. But once all this tariff dust settles, what does the new economic order look like?
Well, the honest answer is I think we still don't know. I think there's one thing we do know now, or at least nothing is forever, and this is so unstable and fluid, it's difficult to be sure, but it looks as though tariffs between the US and China will remain prohibitive. They're at a level, 145% at one level, 125% on the other. These are close to prohibitive tariffs. It's going to make many goods going on both sides unprofitable to trade. So that looks a major shock to the system. What it's going to look like on trade with other countries is still unclear. We have 10% tariffs all round. I suspect they're not going to be lower than that. How much higher than that they're going to be on some countries, I think we genuinely don't know, because that's what's now being discussed. And of course, there are special tariffs on certain industries, particularly automobiles and steel, because he's very, very sensitive on those cases. And there are very complicated arrangements now with Canada and Mexico. USMCA is still, rates are still applied, so they're very, very low. We have this very special exemption, which is supposed to disappear soon, on electronics imports from China, which is exemption from the prohibitive tariffs, but they've already said repeatedly that that's going to disappear. So that's basically what we know, and the rest is just uncertain.
You know, research reports put out over the weekend seem to suggest that the probability of recession is now close to 50-60%. Some CEOs were quoted as saying they think we're already in the middle of a recession. Mr. Wolf, what's your sense? As far as America is concerned, is America already in recession, slipping towards recession, likely to slip into recession?
Well, there are two problems with that. The first is that there is no scientific way of defining a recession. People want to know whether we're in a recession, but there's huge disagreement on what a recession actually means. There's a popular expression, that is to say, a negative growth in 1 quarter or 2 quarters, more normally one. But that's just a popular one. There is no standard definition. So we don't even know whether we're in a recession when we're in one until somebody, basically the National Bureau of Economic Research, has told us that the US has a recession. So that's the first big difficulty. And the second is this is very early in this process. It seems to me perfectly plausible a recession is on the way, but the impact of all this tariff mess on the economy is right at the beginning, and before we get the measurements that show that the economy is really slipping, will probably take months. So my guess is a recession is quite likely, but we definitely don't know yet.
What impact would an American recession have on global growth and the likely impact on India's growth?
Well, here we've got two economies affected. Obviously, a US recession is clearly going to slow the growth of other countries, depending on how open to trade they are. It depends then on how that affects US trading partners, big ones like Europe, Japan, so forth, and then how it affects India. India isn't very open to trade. It would clearly be affected. But given the growth of the Indian economy, there will be a slowdown, but nothing like a recession, I would assume. That would seem extraordinary, and policy can be respond to that. But the other question, of course, is what happens to China? If China's slowdown is quite significant after these tariffs, then that will affect the rest of the world too, particularly commodity exporters, for whom China is a huge market, and that will affect other countries, and we don't know how that's going to work. A very important element in this is a lot of Chinese exports come out via other countries. They're included in products exported from other countries, like, say, Vietnam. Now, at the moment, Vietnam has very low tariffs, about 10%. So presumably, Chinese transshipments, directly or indirectly, via Vietnam and similar countries, will continue. This would suggest that for this period, the effect on the Chinese economy might be muted to a significant degree, and therefore that wouldn't have a big effect on the world. But if the US follows up very quickly by tightening up on transshipment, the use of Vietnam and Chinese supply chain, Vietnam and Chinese supply chains to the world, then it could be more serious. And again, that's something we just don't know about. I argued a long time ago that rules of origin would inevitably come into play in this discriminatory world. All this discrimination we're talking about is illegal under the WTO, but rules of origin would come into play, and that would make it very complicated as the US starts, if you like, bashing a mole as it runs around underground, because Chinese exports are going to reappear in many different places.
What do you make of China's policy response to Trump's tariffs? Far from buckling down, Xi Jinping seems determined to fight on. Do you think he has the right, from China's point of view, the right pushback strategy? Who suffers more in the end, China or the United States?
Well, I don't know whether he's right or not, but I thought it was inevitable. China is a very major power. It's a very proud country. It feels very strongly that it was humiliated in the 19th century, and it's not going to be humiliated again. So to bow down to a bully like Trump, and clearly he is a bully, will be very humiliating for Mr. Xi, and I think more broadly for the Chinese elite. So I always thought they wouldn't do so. They would resist. They have clearly worked very hard over many years to to Trump-proof, if you like, their economy. And I think they will be in reasonable shape to do so. The trade impact will be significant, particularly if, in the long run, the Americans are able to attack indirect Chinese exports, as I discussed. Direct exports from China to the US are not that huge. They can clearly survive. If they attack all the indirect exports, it would be more significant. But China finally has huge policy room. It can expand demand if it wants to. Public sector debt, government debt is very, very modest. It can clearly borrow more and spend more. It can transfer money to households which need it. It has a weak economy anyway, and that would motivate them, I think, to do these sorts of things. So I think they have a pretty fair degree of maneuver, room for maneuver.
But that seems to be against
minimize.
Xi's economic instinct. While he's a communist, he doesn't seem to be a socialist, and this kind of public welfare, social sector spends, from what he's said and done so far, seem to be against his economic instinct.
Yes, that I think is right, but there's an even more important instinct for survival. And I've just been in China a couple of weeks ago, and they are the technocrats I spoke were very clear that they are thinking about serious stimulus policies, really serious. And Mr. Xi knows very well, given that there's a weak demand already, there's a risk of deflation. He will be told by people that if they allow this to tip them over into a serious deflationary problem, with all the debt problems that will create in the private sector, in the local authority sector, that will be very bad for him. So in the end, I expect the Chinese to be pragmatic. Usually they have been.
Donald Trump said famously, I mean, call it what you will, that there are 75 countries that are wanting to kiss his backside, wanting to do trade deals, and he's now given a 90-day pause. India and the United States have said that they hope to conclude a bilateral trade agreement by fall. Is that doable, given the differences of opinion being deeply entrenched, particularly on issues to do with agriculture?
Well, I suspect it's up to India to decide. I'm sure you can do a deal very, very quickly if you accept all America's demands. But at least judging by our experience, because the issue has arisen, agriculture is usually a central element. Agriculture is a very important interest in the United States. And I would have thought, but you would know much more, that for India, acceding to really something close to free trade in agricultural products with the US would be sort of politically out of the question. But I may misjudge that. If that is out of the question, then I would have thought, and also in some other sectors, probably easier services is another sector that will be important. There's not much to worry about with US manufacturers, but agriculture and services could be big issues. And I have no idea whether India is going to make serious concessions. Of course, I also don't know how demanding the US will be with India. There's no doubt Mr. Trump likes Mr. Modi, likes India, and India is a very important country. And if he sort of burns his bridges with China, he's in terrible relations with Europe. Well, he's even got problems with Japan and Korea now. So I would have thought it would be sort of mad for him not to get into terrible trouble with India too. But he's so unpredictable, I'm not sure.
Has Trump thought this through? Is there a grand strategy? I mean, we saw Bill Ackman say, well played, Mr. President. You know, you first unsheath your sword, make it seem as you're going to chop somebody's head off, then say, I give you a 90-day pause, and then the courtiers are clapping. Is this policy thought out, you think, deeply? Or is he just making a policy on the fly based on what his billionaire friends are telling him?
Obviously, I'm not inside Mr. Trump's head. I can only watch him. But I'm pretty clear that I've never seen a sign of very careful strategizing. He doesn't strike me as a brilliant player of three-dimensional chess. So my instinct has always been what you see is what you're getting. He put forward these very radical proposals. They led to market turmoil, and he backed down because it really frightened him. And now he's playing it again by ear. He's always playing it by ear. That's my sense. Could be wrong, because I'm not in his brain, but that's what I see.
There's a lot of talk about what, who emerges stronger in the end, China or the United States. And there have been past examples going back centuries of two leading economic powers unleashing trade wars against each other. Given the relative current state of economic strength, if this war, if there's no back down on either side, and if this is a war till the end, who do you think emerges stronger, China or the US?
Well, I think it's very difficult to say. My guess is China. And I think it's because they are very, very determined. I think this could actually force them to reform in very effective ways. I don't think Trump will be able to stop everybody else trading with China. It's such a huge trading partner for so many other countries. And I think, crucially, that the US has made itself untrustworthy. I mean, the way the US has behaved in these last few months has burnt its relationships and undermined trust in really important partners, Canada and Mexico, obviously, but also Europe. Even Japan and Korea, long-standing allies, are very concerned, is the US trustworthy? And it's not just here about trade. What they've done with Ukraine has also made people feel, is it a US really a trustworthy ally? If it's not a trustworthy ally, and you're a country that already trades a lot with China, and China's next door with its huge and growing military, are you really going to go all out to side yourself with the US and break with China? It would seem very, very risky.
No, so do you think
they're not going to do that?
Do Trump's actions and China's response force countries in the Asia-Pacific region to pick a side? Or will more countries, you think, try and do this fine trapeze, balancing both China and the United States?
That's what I think will happen. Or that's what I think they will try. Now, Mr. Trump may say, if you don't have 100 tariffs like ours on China, we won't import from you. Well, for many countries, then I think they will stick with China. Just as reliable, right there, and for many, a bigger market. Now, it could break up, could make a crisis in ASEAN, for example. But I think simply choosing the US, which is far away and becoming very erratic, over the rising power of China, would for many countries just seem foolhardy. But of course, they will do everything they can to avoid making that choice.
Will China push countries to pick a side between DC and Beijing, or will China not force countries in the Asia-Pacific region to either be with them or against them?
That's a very good question. I think if the Chinese are sensible, they'll leave the Americans to try and force them, because sort of that will give the result. But if it appears that American pressure is starting to make important countries lean towards them, I would well imagine the Chinese will also put pressure on them. And if that happens, then you can imagine lots of countries, I can listen to Indonesia, so forth, in the most horrible situation, because they just won't want to be at war with either of them, of course. It's a terrible situation. But the Chinese will do, they're completely pragmatic, whatever they think they need to do to defend themselves. We can predict that. They will do it fairly cleverly and deliberately. And at this stage, I think all this is really unpredictable. We don't know how this game will play out. They've started a new game. It's a very big game. It will determine the shape of our world, I think. But I'm not at all clear who's going to win.
You know, it's impossible to say for certain, but I want to know your thought. Is this the new normal, these tariffs and the effort that Trump is making after him possibly wins? Or is this just a phase in a very long economic arc?
Well, I think it's probably how it is so long as Trump or someone like Trump remains president. I mean, if Vance succeeds him, for example, I don't know whether he played this game in this way. Trump is sui generis. The way he's done this is sort of unique. Once Trump leaves the scene, and after all he's 78, he is going to leave the scene not that far in the future, I think relations with the US, between the US and China, are going to remain very, very difficult. It's clear that they have now defined each other as the major enemy. And that could last a century. I have no idea how long, but it could last for the indefinite future. But I suspect it wouldn't be played in quite this way. I mean, the tariff trade obsession that Trump has, his desire to have a bilateral balancing and balance trade, that's sort of uniquely him, and it might not last in that form. But the great rivalry is the fundamental structure of our world, it now seems to me.
For sharing the wealth of your insights in a very turbulent world, Martin Wolf, thank you for your time.
Great pleasure.
Thank you, sir.